years, 9 months and 9 days. Moved around, we lived in Stenning in West Sussex, and we went from place to place, living with relatives and stuff like that, because my mother had no income and no benefits in those days. That was before 1947, before the National Health Service and all the benefits came in. And so we moved all over the place, and then eventually my mother remarried in 1944, and we went down to Somerset for a year. My stepfather was a farm worker, and he was working for a cousin in Somerset. And I remember 1944 very clearly, because we had what was called double summertime. The clocks went forward not 1 hour in March, but 2. So the farmers could work late under daylight. We didn't have fancy lights in those days. It was all daylight or nothing. Then I came back to Sussex in 1945. My stepfather then was working with his brother and brother-in-law on a farm near Falking, and I can't remember how long I was there. Then my half-brother was born in 1947, the same age as Prince Charles. Yeah, my stepfather was wonderful at getting jobs. He was not quite so efficient at keeping them, so we were always on the move, and we always lived in what were called tied cottages. The house went with the job. So if you lost your job, you lost your house. And he worked for a butcher in Stenning, and then got another job. He eventually came to Hove in 1949, 1950, and got 1 or 2 jobs with the Port Slade District Council, and then eventually with Hove Council, Hove Borough Council as it was in those days, as a gardener, and he kept that job until he retired. My sister Mary had died the year before, I think. She was only 2.5 months old. She had spina bifida. On that day, that's why I remember it so clearly, the 3rd of September 1939, I was taken to church, which was literally a tin church made of corrugated iron and painted green, and it was in Upper Beeding in Stenning. It's where the Baptist church now stands, in Church Lane. And my mother said it was a Boy Scout who walked up the aisle, but I remember somebody walking up the aisle, handing the preacher a note, and the preacher said, "We are at war with Germany." And then sirens went off. And I walked home with my mother and 1 or 2 friends, and we had about a 2.5 mile walk. And the lady said to me, "You won't be able to have any more peaches and ice creams because of the war." And it wasn't until years and years and years later I realised I never did have peaches and ice creams because we were so poor. My mother was a single mother. My father cleared off in 1938. He came home one night from work, got off the bus. My grandmother was laying in wait for him, and my grandmother was a fearsome character. And I don't know what she said to him, but he came into the home in a furious temper and said to my mother he was going to Southampton on business. We never heard from him again. I don't expect you ever heard of the religious cult or sect, the Exclusive Brethren. Well, there was a chap called John Darby who formed the Brethren in Plymouth, and then they had two divisions. There was the Open Brethren and the Exclusive Brethren. My grandmother joined the Exclusive Brethren, and they had a meeting hall in Stenning, and she rented a cottage just opposite, and she used to take me along to these services. 4.5 hours of utter boredom every Sunday. I hated Sundays. Anyway, one day we were in the cottage, and there was a massive bang, and I remember I dived under a bed. It was too late, of course, but anyway, the lane filled with dust. And then we discovered that the German airplane had dropped a bomb on 6 cottages in Stenning. You can see the site where it dropped because I built 2 houses there. And I would think if you were going to buy one, you'd have to have best part of £750,000 for each one. Very expensive. Little cottages, now they're expensive houses. But my mother was delivering bread. She worked as a driver for Woods, the garage, and then she was working for Mrs. Gocher, a local baker. And Mrs. Gocher actually has written a piece about the event. It's in the Stenning Museum, but she never mentions my mother's name. She says we, meaning my mother and her were in the road, but she doesn't actually mention my mother's name. But my mother says the aeroplane flew over the Stenning Church, St Andrews, and it was so low she could see the pilot's face. Then he dropped the bomb, or bombs, I think it was only one bomb, on these little cottages, killed one lady sadly, and then I think he then flew off over the downs back to France. So that was a bit of excitement, and that was the nearest I came to a bomb, I think, during the war. Where I lived just in Stenning, and we lived in a house that I think my great aunt rented it, and we were on a flight path from France, and you could hear the German bombers come over en masse, going to London. We were right on the flight path to London, and the drone, I can still hear it. But I mean, London really suffered, but we didn't seem really to react that much. We just carried on with life. Stenning is a very small little town where people just do their own business. And it was very strange. I've often reflected on it. And I can't understand how it was. We didn't seem to react at all. So I remember the day the war ended, because, excuse me, I used to have to walk about a mile. We lived on a farm at the time, and we would have to walk about a mile down to the crossroads to pick up a bus, and it didn't come that day, and I had a feeling. So I went back home, and Mother said the war's over. That was a victory in Europe, and the victory in Japan. And I remember my stepfather wanted to go to the pictures. My mother didn't like the pictures, but my stepfather loved them. So we came into Brighton, to West Street. There were lots of cinemas in West Street at the time. And I can remember everybody was getting drunk and going mad. And I remember two soldiers fighting in the street, in the gutter. They were literally rolling around in the gutter, fighting like mad. And it was chaos. And I was quite glad to get home, really. Then, of course, we had the settling down period after the war. We had to rebuild the economy and rebuild London. London was very badly battered. Food was short, yes, was short, and we were very poor. We didn't own a property, my stepfather had a car. He bought one when he came back to Sussex from Somerset, a little Austin, 1934 Austin 7, which he drove very badly. He was a terrible driver. He's a lovely man, but a terrible driver. And I couldn't have had a better father-in-law, to be honest. That was Archie. He was a lovely man. But I seem to remember it was a yellow tin, and it was bright yellow. So I imagine they only kept the yolks, and you had to use them very sparingly. A very little thing. I don't think we ever had bacon. My mother was very thrifty. She could make a meat pie, which was 2/3, no, more than that, probably 9/10 pastry, 1/10 meat. She could stretch meat like nobody's business. Yes, food was very short. We grew vegetables in the garden. Everybody was encouraged to do that. My aunt had an apple tree in her garden, so that was okay. And I think we grew things like runner beans and carrots and potatoes, cabbage and things like that. They were quite easy things to grow. And my mum, there was a shop in Stenning, it's now an off licence, it was called Burdock's, the grocers. And they had along the front of the counter a lot of tins, which were biscuit tins. And one tin, actually, this wasn't a biscuit tin, it was Maserati tea. I always remember that. There was a picture of an old lady and a little girl on the front, a bit like my grandmother and my mother. My mother always, I think, rather hoped she'd get something under the counter, but it was very straight. You didn't get a thing under the counter. And the man used to write down on a piece of brown paper, on the bag you bought it in, what the price of it was, and he added it up and he said in a second. It was better than a computer, because a computer will often take a long time to put the information in. But no, food was short. Yes, was short.